next speaker is Miss NOOR ALSAYED. She's going to present her talk titled Investigating Obesity-Related Behaviors in Friendship Networks Among the Youth, a Systemized Review. Noor, please take the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is NOOR ALSAYED, and I'm a PhD student at Brunel University, London. And I'll be talking to you today about a literature review paper that I've written on obesity-related behaviors among adolescents and children. So I'll start by introducing you to the topic. I'll then move on to talk a bit about the background, about the literature review findings, and I'll end it with the conclusion and some recommendations for future research. So obesity is actually a very complex problem because it's caused by multiple factors. But what has changed over the last 30 years or so is our lifestyles. So we're eating more unhealthy food, we're moving less, and we're spending more time on our computers, on our smartphones and handheld devices. And one of the hypothesized causes of the continued increase in the current obesity epidemic is that the current preventative measures and the current interventions, they are individually targeted, and they lack the proper understanding of obesity in the social context. And what do I mean by that? I mean that there are actually measures in place, but these measures, they will focus on the individual and they will ignore the social environment, the social surroundings of the individual. And they have been failing because obesity is actually a social epidemic, and obesity was found to spread over social networks between family members, between friends, peers, partners, etc. So it is actually important to consider the social surroundings and the social networks. What do I mean by social networks? By social networks, I'm referring to the ties and relationships we have with people around us. So what social influence theories propose is that the health behavior of the individual is very much influenced by the health behavior of their social surrounding. And the closer that person is to the individual, the more intimate the relationship is, the more likely they're going to influence our behavior. Much of the research that was done in the obesity context or the obesity literature focuses on social influence and how people influence each other. But they ignore the structure of the social networks and the different properties, the characteristics of the social networks, and how could these make individuals more vulnerable to obesity. So why is the structure of the network important? Because actually in other health disciplines, certain properties were found and identified as important to the spread and maintenance of certain behaviors. For instance, if we look at network size refers to the number of individuals you have in the network, in your social network. And poor health behavior was generally found to be associated with sort of a smaller network size, so social isolates compared to people who have more people in their social network are at higher risk of poor health behaviors. Another important property is popularity. So receiving friendship nominations, those who are popular in the network, especially among adolescents, these individuals are at higher risk of some health risk behaviors, including using drugs and drinking, and as I think Dr. Nella was talking about, addiction. So the more popular individuals are at higher risk of certain behaviors. So what I did was I did a systemized literature review to sort of look at the existing literature and synthesize it over the sort of the different obesity-related behaviors in the different friendship networks. And a systemized literature review is like, you could say, a less rigid, systematic literature review because it encompasses some of the aspects of a systematic literature review, but not all. And I came up with 14 studies. The majority of the studies were investigating adolescents, so those aged 11 to 19-year-old, and there were a few studies on children and young adults, but the reason why adolescents are sort of heavily investigated in this phenomena is because they are at higher risk and they're more vulnerable to peer influence and peer pressure. So the obesity-related behaviors that were investigated in the social context were mainly diet and physical activity, mainly because these two behaviors were identified as the two big sort of contributors by the CDC to the current obesity epidemic. There's less research on sedentary behavior also. And if we're looking at friendship networks and how these obesity-related behaviors sort of work in friendship networks, we're looking at two big themes in the literature. The first theme, you're looking at sort of similarities or associations or relationships between the individual's behavior and between the friend's behavior. And this is, you could say, there's many studies doing that. The more recent theme is investigating sort of associations between the individual's obesity-related behavior and the properties of the networks. So this is more recent, there's less research on that, but this was already, as I mentioned, done in other health disciplines. So looking at diet, for instance. So when it comes to diet, there are findings in the literature to confirm that there are similarities, but only in certain dietary behaviors. For instance, consumption of fast food, that was found similar among friends. Also consumption of snacks. But when it comes for example, on whether or not the teenagers will eat breakfast, there was not really evidence for that. And what researchers were saying is that the similarities between the parents more than the peers and the friends. But one important network property that appears is the individual popularity. So the more popular sort of kids in the networks were found to be the highest consumers of unhealthy snacks, specifically among boys. When it comes to physical activity, there is consensus. All the studies that investigated physical activity says that there are similarities between the individual's physical activity levels and the friend's physical activity levels. One important network property is the network size. So the more friends the individual will have in their social network, the more likely they're going to be physically active. With sedentary behavior, as I already mentioned, there's less research, but again, there's really no consistent evidence on whether or not there are similarities between the friends and their sedentary behavior. One important network property that appeared was network density, where boys in more dense networks were found to be more sedentary, at higher risk of sedentary compared to other kids. So in conclusion, really, what the literature is suggesting is that friendships are an important social context for the spread and maintenance of obesity, certain obesity-related behaviors. And although friendship networks, they have been linked to obesity-related behaviors, however, they have not been extensively examined. Now, someone might wonder what's the benefit from such review? Well, actually, these results are informative for designing more effective public health interventions known as network-based interventions that have been found successful in other parts of the world. So as for recommendations for future research, the researchers are recommending for future studies in different cultural contexts and different clinical samples. So one of the things I'll be doing in my PhD is, which I already started, is to look at schools in Bahrain, so public schools, private schools, because that might give us a bit of an insight. Additionally, future studies should investigate whether friendship networks influence obesity via other pathways. So the majority of the studies were looking at diet and physical activity, but things like sleep and sleep deprivation, which is an important predictor of obesity, has generally been neglected in the social context, and this is something I'm planning to address. Finally, further investigation of the type of associations between the networks and some of the obesity-related behaviors is also needed to advance our knowledge. And again, one of the things I'm trying to look at is to see whether these network properties or the network characteristics could moderate perhaps the association between the individual behavior and the friend's behavior. That's it. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
It's a question for NOOR. When you start, have you designed your data collection method yet?
Yes, I've actually, you mean the conceptual model or the methods?
The method.
Yes, I've actually started collecting my data. I'm in the process of sort of wrapping up. So.
Do you include time spent on social networks?
No. When I'm talking about social networks, at least for my thesis, I'm always referring to like physical ties and relationships.
Yes.
And in my PhD, I'm focusing on school children, so those aged between 11 and 19. And because I'm doing social network analysis, and I'm using there are two methods of social network analysis, egocentric and sociometric. Because I'm going with sociometric, which is a complete network data, I'm limiting it to the school friendships.
Okay.
So
There's some evidence in the UK.
yeah,
Obesity is linked to the number of hours spent on social networks.
absolutely.
So-
Social media and so, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And in the UK, the general question is, who's to blame for child obesity? Is it really McDonald's or is it Facebook?
Yeah, that's true. It's a good argument. It's something I'm planning to do in the future, is to look at social networks, and not just physical ties,
Yes.
but maybe even sort of electronic ties or something, like friendships
Thank you.
over Facebook.
Thank you,
etc.
Noor.
Welcome.
As usual.
Thank you.
Great job.
Why have you concentrated on obesity? Do you have any percentage of obese kids here in Bahrain, for example? How much the percentage? Is it a problem that here you suffer from Sudan, we don't have obese kids at all?
You mean for me or for?
Reem or obesity?
For obesity, okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, actually, obesity is a problem in the Gulf, and
How much the percentage be among the kids?
well, the last time there was a news article about this, and in my samples, and I'm addressing children between 11 and 19. There's around, you could say, 30 to 40% are overweight and obese together. With adults, it's actually worse, because the percentage is up to 70% among Bahraini female women. There was an article published, a news article published in Bahrain, and it's more than men. For men, it's overweight and obesity is like 50%. So with women, the problem is worse among adults. Yeah.
How are you going to serve the epidemiology sciences, especially it is the cornerstone of public health in Bahrain? Please.
And now I would like to ask Professor Abdallah Al-Hawaj to please join the stage with Professor Alam Ahmed to give certificates of appreciation to our speakers. Ms. Noor Al-Sayed.